Despite Western complicity in Israel's genocidal war against Gaza, without which this entire atrocity would have proved impossible, finally falling apart. Yesterday, the United Nations Security Council voted for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It was a motion tabled by the 10 non-permanent members and voted for by all of them, plus 4 of the permanent members. That includes Britain, as well as France, Russia and China. And crucially, the United States, that is Israel's patron, which allows Israel to do what it wishes, given it's the world's only superpower that matters, abstained. In other words, it did not use its veto, as it has previously done over and over again, to prevent this resolution from passing. Alas, an amendment proposed by Russia calling for a permanent ceasefire did not pass, not to give Russia credit here, given what it's doing to Ukraine and what it did to, say, Chechnya many years ago. Its motives are certainly not pure, but driven by crude strategic calculation that the US is further destroying its own global power, and the likes of Russia are looking to fill the vacuum, cultivating relationships, for example, across the Middle East. But needs must, doesn't matter in this context who's proposing the right thing, whatever the reasons may be. Nonetheless, this resolution passing is an important step and was hailed by Riyad Mansour, the Palestinian representative at the United Nations, as a belated vote for humanity to prevail. It places demands on all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, accordingly deplores all attacks on civilians and civilian objects, as well as violence and hostilities against civilians and all acts of terrorism. And also, it quite correctly restates that the taking of hostages is prohibited under international law. Just on the point there about terrorism, which has been conveniently increasingly defined over the years as violence directed against civilians for political ends by non-state actors, that's very convenient, of course, for states like Israel, who can use this arbitrary definition to claim their violence is legitimate and moral in contrast to their opponents, even though Israel clearly uses state violence to achieve political ends. Just Google the Daher doctrine developed by Israel in the 2006 Lebanon War, which centres on deploying huge violence against civilian targets to encourage civilians to turn on, in that case, Hezbollah, in the case of Gaza, Hamas. Well, that is state terrorism, obviously. So I'm glad the resolution allows for potential consistency in how that word is defined. The resolution rightly expresses deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. That's putting it mildly, since it has suffered, Gaza, the worst collapse in nutritional status of any population in recorded history, caused by a famine manufactured entirely by Israel, alongside the mass destruction of its healthcare system, the mass displacement of virtually the entire population, the devastation of its civilian infrastructure, the siege, and of course on all the essentials of life. Well, we really could go on, but there is a reason, lots of good reasons, why we describe this as genocidal. What it demands is an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading, of course, to, as it says, an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access and all parties complying with obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. Some important points there. Obviously, all hostages taken by Hamas and other armed groups must be released. It was and is a war crime to take hostages, as I say. That should also apply to the huge numbers of Palestinians seized by Israel without charge, not least in the West Bank, including children, who the courageous Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, who I've interviewed, rightly describes as Israel's own hostages, with overwhelming evidence about torture and arbitrary killings of detainees, as well as sexual violence. Now, ensuring humanitarian access, it says, well, that's what the International Court of Justice demanded as a provisional order for Israel to avoid genocide. And Israel has wantonly flouted this demand, from the deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid entering Gaza, as the UK government officially detailed via a public letter from the Foreign Secretary David Cameron, to its war on UNRWA, Gaza's main humanitarian agency, based on unevidenced smears. Now, UNRWA, of course, has been banned from taking any aid into northern Gaza just recently by Israel. And it's there where the most catastrophic situation, of course, of anywhere in Gaza exists. Now, it emphasises the resolution the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip. Well, bad news then there in terms of the siege imposed on Gaza by Israel and the mass destruction of infrastructure and the collapse in security, those latter two factors making what little aid enters rather hard to transport to those who need it, to say the least. Hence, civilians are resorting to eating animal feed and grass as they slowly starve to death. Now, the resolution reiterates the demand of the Security Council for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale. Well, all of this means, of course, engaging with why that's not happening, which is the genocidal intent of the Israeli state, which is very transparently driven by two things, which we can note because of the things they keep saying and have said all the way through: intent and their actions, murderous vengeance against the population it regards as collectively guilty and clearly less than human, as well as a desire for Gaza to be emptied of Palestinians. Now, this resolution is clearly a step forward. On the one hand, it underlines Israel's growing isolation, though worth pointing out Israel was already isolated in much of the world. It's a rogue state which has been protected with rampant criminality, violations of international law, because of the patronage of a superpower, which in this case didn't veto this particular resolution, unlike its past behaviour. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, was furious about this perceived betrayal from his patron, which he depends on for arms sales, vast amounts of aid, and indeed diplomatic protection. So to use the vernacular I grew up with in the north of England, he's had a right on mad and cancelled a visit to the White House. Well, let's hear the White House National Security Communications Advisor, and that is John Kirby, responding to a question about that.
John, what was the president's reaction to the decision by Netanyahu not to send an Israeli delegation this week?
I got to tell you, Steve, we're kind of perplexed by this. A couple of points that need to be stated and, in fact, restated. Number one, it's a non-binding resolution, so there's no impact at all on Israel and Israel's ability to continue to go after Hamas. Number two, as I said in my opening statement, it does not represent a change at all in our policy. It's very consistent with everything that we've been saying we want to get done here. And we get to decide what our policy is. The Prime Minister's office seems to be indicating through public statements that we somehow changed here. We haven't. And we get to decide what our policy is. It seems like the Prime Minister's office is choosing to create a perception of daylight here when they don't need to do that. So again, no change in our policy.
Well, that's pretty cringe, to say the least, as the US administration seeks to blunt the impact of a resolution it abstained on, declaring it as non-binding, a non-binding resolution with no impact on Israel's military strategy, with the calamity we've seen in terms of consequences. That doesn't change the US position, trying to diminish the idea there's any meaningful difference with Israel as it unleashes genocide, violence and famine. It's not legally binding, they say. Well, let's just fact-check that, because as research analyst Nax Bilal points out, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, that is the UN court, the highest court on earth, in the Namibia 1971 ruling under Article 25 of the UN Charter, declares that such resolutions are, in fact, binding. The representatives of Mozambique and Sierra Leone, both hailing from legal backgrounds, correctly declared the resolution to be binding as well at the Security Council. That's been backed variously by, for example, Gérard Araud, the former French ambassador to the US, the United Nations, and Israel itself. Let's listen to this Al Jazeera senior correspondent Imran Khan, who explains more.
The UN resolution, it is binding, it is international law, but Israel can ignore it because it still has the key support of the US, $3.5 billion a year in military assistance alone. That money hasn't been threatened. So there is a rift in the relationship. There is a public-facing rift in that US relationship, but backstage, where it counts, the money, that's still coming.
Well, yes, this really, I'm afraid, sums up the farce of international law, where it exists in the abstract, but in practical terms, how it's applied and enforced depending on who has power. And in this case, that is the US, and they're the key allies of Israel, so they can just flout international law. Rogue states indeed. Indeed, note that the US has said it will find ways to warn Israel against attacking Rafah, where much of Gaza's desperate population has been displaced, which means nothing because the US is refusing to use the leverage that it actually has over Israel. The arguments they're making are not simply about the loss of civilian life, but they say this type of invasion would weaken Israel's security, would make Israel less safe, not more safe. It would undermine its standing in the world. It's a bit late for that, guys. If I'm honest, the damage inflicted on the reputation of the Israeli state globally is catastrophic and irreversible, barring some total transformation in the nature of the entity which governs the Israeli and Palestinian populations, the latter subjected to apartheid and, in the present, genocide. And indeed, a lasting just peace must protect the security of both. That is, none of them are going anywhere. The land belongs to them both. Now, what's going on here? Well, this is significant. I don't think we should water down that significance. Israel's in a much weaker position than it was, quite clearly. US power, which has already been in steep decline in the 21st century, in significant part due to the catastrophic foreign military adventures it has itself pursued, has been severely damaged. The global south, epitomised, of course, by South Africa, hauling Israel before the International Court of Justice for alleged genocide, has been strengthened, and you can see their moral authority strengthened. The global south, and the diplomatic presence and muscle growing. There are lots of factors behind all this. I think we need to pay special tribute to the unbelievably courageous Palestinian journalists, many of whom have lost their lives, some of them slaughtered, not just alone, but alongside their entire families, including with their little children, in the biggest mass killing of journalists in any conflict ever recorded in history. And they brought to the world at such cost, at such sacrifice, the horrors inflicted by the Israeli state, well, some of them, and they've ensured that despite the attempts by Israel to cover up this historic crime, the world has been able to see this atrocity for what it is, and that has had a huge impact, as have the peace movements across the global north demanding this horror ends. And indeed, Benjamin Netanyahu has himself been quoted privately fretting over the impact of these demonstrations. It's all having an impact. All of that is contributing to what is clearly, increasingly, a catastrophic strategic defeat for Israel and its patron. But that's not something really to rejoice, is it? Given the utter horror and carnage and mass slaughter of so many innocent people, with so much horror and carnage and mass slaughter of so many innocent people still to come, we need to be honest about that fact. But it is easier now to see a future in which Israel cannot so violently deprive the Palestinian people of their basic rights because of their own murderous hubris. But the lesson here, we have to keep on pushing. Because this nightmare, and clearly I do not mean just the nightmare which began since 7th of October, I mean the generations of nightmare that the Palestinian people have been forced to endure can only end when Western states, which have allowed Israel to get away with it, are forced to make it all stop. So, I think we've got a lot of work to do there. Please like and subscribe. Do share this video. Keep it showing the road on patreon.com/. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.